They called him the man who never died, but that title betrays the fire that once burned in his soul. Long before his name turned to myth, Enoch was flesh and bone, born into a world where men still remembered the taste of Eden, but spat it out for blood and pride. He did not ask for holiness. He was not born a prophet. He was a man surrounded by decay, a man who saw the fractures in his own family line and chose not to look away. In a world racing toward darkness, his silence became his rebellion. The world Enoch inherited wasn't noble or pure. It was a beautiful ruin. Sons of Cain and Seth alike had forgotten their origins. The children of Adam built cities of noise and steel, but their hearts were ash. The further they moved from Eden, the louder their laughter echoed in empty temples. Men fought for dominion, not righteousness. The altars bled animals, but not pride. Yet Enoch, amidst this chaos, walked the other way. Every step he took toward God was a step away from mankind, and that made him dangerous, because he reminded them of who they had stopped being. He was not born righteous. Righteousness is not inherited, it is chosen, painfully, privately. As a boy, he asked questions that silenced rooms. Why do we kill to prove strength? Why do we mock the God who made us? Why do we build towers to heaven but never kneel? These weren't questions of philosophy, they were indictments, and so Enoch grew alone. But solitude has a voice. In the hush of the wind, in the break of twilight, he began to hear something that men no longer heard. God still speaks. The voice wasn't thunder. It didn't part seas or shatter stones. It whispered, it invited, it pierced. God did not demand worship. He craved nearness. Enoch heard this call and followed, not because he was better, but because he was willing to look foolish, willing to abandon everything for a voice no one else heard. And as he walked deeper into that silence, something began to change. His steps grew lighter, his thoughts sharper. The world became a veil, and he slowly was learning to see through it. But walking with God in a world that mocks him is a declaration of war. Enoch's neighbors laughed, his family worried. What did he gain from this holy isolation? No wine, no gold, no acclaim. Just solitude, just questions. But it was not loneliness that consumed him. It was clarity. Each day he stepped further from man's approval and closer to a burning presence that no fire could mimic. He didn't just believe in God, he communed. He didn't just pray, he listened. And listening, truly listening, is what led him to the edge of the known world. The closer Enoch came to God, the more dangerous he became to the systems built on ignorance. His life became a sermon without words. A man who refused to play by the rules of a broken world cannot be ignored. He must be exiled or exalted. And when a man can no longer be mocked or bought, the world begins to fear him. Rumors spread. Some said he was touched by angels. Others whispered he had gone mad. But truth has always worn the mask of madness to those still drunk on illusion. Then came the visions, uninvited, undeniable. In his solitude, God began to show him what others were too numb to see. A coming flood, a breaking world, the wrath of heaven dressed in rain. Not metaphor, reality. Enoch saw men trading souls for stone, mocking judgment like a joke. He saw blood in the soil, and then he saw silence. Not absence, but verdict. God would not wait forever. Justice delayed is not justice denied. And Enoch knew he had to speak, not to save them, but to warn them. Truth unspoken is complicity. His voice shook the valley. It wasn't loud, but it cut. He spoke not of mercy first, but of reckoning, of a holy God weary of being ignored, of a flood not of water, but of justice. Some scoffed. Some wept, but most turned their backs, not realizing the mercy in being warned. And that night, Enoch knelt alone again, not because he doubted, but because the weight of knowing was too much for one man. Yet he bore it, not for fame, but because the truth, once seen, is a fire that cannot be ignored. Years passed. His son Methuselah was born. Enoch loved him fiercely, knowing the child's name. When he dies, it shall come, was a prophecy itself. Enoch raised him in reverence and in dread, not dread of doom, but of destiny. For he saw the thread running through generations, from Adam's grief to Abel's blood to Noah's boat. The world would drown, yes, but not before grace had been offered through warning. And that made Enoch's voice urgent, even when no one was listening, especially then. And then he vanished. No deathbed, no tomb, no goodbye. One moment he walked, the next he was gone. They searched the hills, they cried to the skies, but the earth could no longer hold him. He had walked with God, and then God walked him home. His disappearance was not an escape. It was a judgment, a sign, a divine protest against a world that refused to change. And those left behind, they didn't forget. They couldn't. Because a man who walks so close to heaven leaves footprints on the soul of history. They stood in silence where Enoch once walked, waiting for a voice that would never echo again. His absence was louder than his words had ever been. No one could explain it, but everyone felt it. God had reached down, not in wrath, but in withdrawal, as if the heavens had taken back what the earth no longer deserved. There was no lightning, no burning bush, just a void. And in that void, hearts trembled. Even those who dismissed him in life felt the hollow echo he left behind. Something sacred had vanished, and they knew it. But what frightened them more wasn't that Enoch was gone. It was what that disappearance implied. If a man could become so close to God that the world could no longer contain him, then everything Enoch said about the coming judgment, about heaven watching, might actually be true. Suddenly jokes became memories. Laughter turned into unease, and the stories began to spread like wildfire, whispered under breath, shared in shadows. Enoch became less a man and more a warning, a living parable carved into memory by his absence alone. Generations passed, and yet no one could quite shake his name. His son Methuselah grew old. His grandson Lamech whispered the tale to his own child, a quiet boy named Noah. And though the others built altars to their own egos and buried the warnings of the past, Noah listened. In his blood, something ancient stirred. Not knowledge, but memory. The legacy of a man who didn't die, but was taken. That kind of holiness doesn't skip generations. It waits. It waits in silence until the earth is ready for thunder again. But let's be clear. Enoch wasn't perfect. He was a man, flawed and vulnerable. He doubted, he ached, he yearned for answers, and that is what made his walk with God so powerful. Not because he had all the answers, but because he asked better questions than anyone else. His strength wasn't in being holy. It was in being willing to wrestle with the divine, to look madness in the face and still kneel. In that tension between confusion and trust, Enoch found what others spent lifetimes avoiding: intimacy with the Creator. And perhaps that's the real tragedy of his disappearance. Not that the world lost a prophet, but that it never wanted one to begin with. Humanity has always been more comfortable with entertainers than with truth-tellers. The mob will crown a jester, but they'll stone a mirror. Enoch held up that mirror, not just to society, but to the soul. And we blinked, we looked away. And when he was gone, we painted his name in gold, all while continuing to walk the path he begged us to abandon. There's irony in how we remember him. We call him the man who didn't die, as if that's the miracle. But the real miracle wasn't that he escaped death. It's that he walked with God when no one else cared to. That he stayed close to heaven in a world sprinting toward hell. That he found meaning not in miracles or manifestations, but in stillness. Enoch didn't ascend to avoid the world. He was taken because the world had already exiled him in spirit. When a man belongs more to eternity than to earth, eternity eventually claims him, and so now we are left with a choice, the same one his generation faced. Will we chase noise or silence, applause or awe? Will we remember his story as myth or see it as a mirror held up to our own unraveling lives? Because the truth Enoch carried didn't die with him. It lingers, in the gaps between thoughts, in the questions we're too afraid to ask, in the still moments where we know, deep down, that there must be something more. His story isn't finished. It's just waiting for someone to pick it up again. Look around. The world today is not unlike Enoch's. Beautiful, violent, distracted. We build towers higher than Babel and scream louder than Sodom. But the ache remains. The hunger, the cosmic homesickness. And somewhere a whisper still calls, "Walk with me." Not for reward, not for escape, but because the path of rebellion is not to curse the world, but to live so differently that heaven has no choice but to make room for you. That is what Enoch did. That is what we're called to do. Not preach, but embody. Not escape, but transcend. Perhaps Enoch wasn't taken to reward him, but to warn us. Perhaps his ascension was not an ending, but a rupture. A divine punctuation that split history into before and after. Before him, man believed he must die. After him, we knew death is not the only end. There is a way of living so aligned with heaven that the world loses its grip. And maybe that's why his story has survived centuries. Not because it tells us about God's power, but because it dares us to imagine God's proximity. So now, the question isn't whether Enoch walked with God. That's already written. The question is, who among us will walk next? Not into the clouds, not into glory, but into the kind of life that makes earth uncomfortable and heaven take notice. Enoch didn't leave to escape the world. He left to show it that there's another way to live. And if you're quiet long enough, if you stand still in the roar of modern life, you might hear that same whisper, calling, waiting, ready